Well, welcome everybody. My name is Daren Graves. I'm an associate professor of social work and education at Simmons University. I'm here with my co-author and co-research partner, Dr. Scott Sider from Boston College. And we're here to talk about schooling for critical consciousness. It's the title of our book, and it's the topic of today's webinar, where we're talking about how to help engage Black and Latinx youth in analyzing, navigating, and challenging racial injustice. So we're going to give you a quick overview of what's going to happen in today's presentation. We'll start off by giving you an introduction to critical consciousness, how we're defining it, what our framework is, why it's important to think about. And then we're going to talk about, it'll give us a chance for us to dive into our research and show you 5 different tools for fostering critical consciousness that we saw during our research endeavors. And then we would, I guess we'll have time for questions, comments, and feedback at the end. And so we'll do all that, and then we'll be finished. So we will move in to our introduction to critical consciousness. So this first slide is really to help us contextualize this work and why this work is important. And the ironic part about this, the context is that when Scott and I, embarked on this research endeavor around, 2012 or so, minus the COVID, of course, many of the issues around race, racism, police brutality, so on and so forth, were very much at the forefront of our public conversation as it is today. And so back then, as we were, dealing with the latest, at that point, latest iteration of these types of issues, there was a lot of talk about how parents were especially Black parents, were socializing their children to help, deal with the pernicious effects of racism. And Scott and I, as parents, could definitely understand that that line of thinking. And Scott and I, as education researchers and teacher educators, were really interested in how, if at all, schools were preparing students, particularly of students of color, to make sense of any of these issues, whether it's about race, racism, police brutality, those issues, or whether we're talking about issues like coronavirus these days, right? Much less do something about any of these issues. And so it's our work these days is very topical, as we have all these issues such as coronavirus and these issues of racism at the forefront, and we're really trying to figure out what it is schools can or should be doing about this for our young folks. And for us, this is really important because from a developmental psychology perspective, right, which both of us are trained as developmental psychologists, there's a lot of research out there that shows that young folks of color are understanding how race and racism works from very young ages, right? Even as early as 6, probably younger than that, right? We're finding that folks of color, especially by the time they get to adolescence, will have very likely experienced some form of racial discrimination, right? And so those experiences that young folks are having in their lives, their lived experiences, we think are flying in contrast to a lot of the idealized narratives around meritocracy that we see in our society writ large, and our schools in particular, right? And so how do young folks deal with this narrative? On the one hand, it says it doesn't matter whether you're Black and white, it just matters how hard you try, and that's how you'll be rewarded, versus these lived experiences that they're having, especially students of color are having, that fly in the face of that or contradict that narrative. And so we drew inspiration from Dr. Teresa Perry, who did a lot of work around studying how the history of Black schooling, right? And she argued that Black schools, though yes, under-resourced, segregated, underwhelming and unequitable in those ways, right, had an intentional mission to help students build identities of achievement in the face of the very real messaging that young folks were getting in society that was not confusing, that was not contradictory. The messages that folks were getting, especially in those days, was that Black folks were not intellectually capable, not deserving of school, not fully human, right? And so what Teresa Perry argues is that Black schools then became sites where they took these narratives of Black intellectual inferiority and turned them on their heads, right? And made it a places where to create intentional counter narratives around the intellectual capabilities of Black folks. And then held students to high expectations, right? Academically, in the face of all the resources that they were denied, to produce Black excellence. And so what Teresa Perry does is shows us that there's a legacy, as far back as times when educating Black folks was deemed like absolutely illegal, up through times where, even through desegregated times where schools that produced excellence used this identity-centered approach that was geared towards intentionally pushing back against the problematic notions of who larger society said Black people in particular could or could not be, okay? And that identity-centered approach around pushing back against those commonly held problematic notions, and that route leading to academic excellence is mirrored in some of the work that we're seeing from scholars more contemporarily. So we have Dorinda Carter-Andrews here, who talks about achievement as resistance, and we have Dr. Tara Yoso, who talked about resilient resistance. And you can see in both of these instances, they have found that having achievement as resistance, this notion of achievement as resistance or resilient resistance, is a set of dispositions and behaviors and beliefs that students of color in particular take on that then encourage them, motivate them to do well in school or beyond, right? And so this notion of creating this contested identity space intentionally, producing positive results, especially academically and psychosocially, are things that we're finding both in a historical analysis that Perry laid out, and we're seeing in more contemporary research, as we see from Yoso and Carter-Andrews. And so for us, so what does that mean what does that mean for us in terms of critical consciousness? So critical consciousness for us, right, is in order for one to have critical consciousness or to be able to develop critical consciousness. In order for one to develop what we would call that achievement as resistance frame, or that resistant resilience frame, one would need a sense of critical consciousness. And we're defining critical consciousness based on the work of Paulo Freire as the ability to recognize oppressive social forces shaping society and take action against them. So let me just contextualize this real quick and then focus on two quick things. So this definition comes from Paulo Freire, famous Brazilian educational philosopher, from his famous book, Pedagogies of the Oppressed. For those of us who may not know, Freire worked in Brazil with very poor, rural Brazilians for whom the political economy was not really working for them, if not oppressing them, right? And then in this work with these folks, Freire turned schooling into a exercise or a project in giving the folks he was working with the tools to perceive and understand what it is that was actually causing their oppression, and then to do something, and then to give them the tools to transform their own conditions, right? To transform their own conditions, right? And so in this way, we always think of schooling as political, but not political as in partisan, but political as what are the political purposes of schooling, right? And for Freire, it's very much about disrupting power structures and disrupting hierarchy, right? That's unfair. And giving folks who don't have privilege the tools to be able to recognize, right, this analysis piece, right, and the oppressive forces that they're going up against, and then to do something about it, to take action, right? And so this quotation at the end, this notion of we're reading the word in order to read the world, right? So in other words, we're taking this functional literacy, right, and making it a tools for critical literacy and transformative literacy. And so we were really interested in how schools might help students do that, right? Now, why does critical consciousness matter at all before we even dive into that, right? There's so much research that shows that this notion of critical consciousness development is not a diversion, right, from the goals that we all have as educators and folks who work with young folks, not an extra thing that we need to do, but more root to the outcomes that we're all naturally interested in as educators and folks who work with youth. And so we have found there's much research. We've listed some of it here that shows the way that critical consciousness is associated with things like high self-esteem, more political engagement, higher professional aspirations, higher academic engagement, and yes, higher academic achievement. Here we see a thumbnail of one of our research papers from the project, in which we found that in our project, that higher critical consciousness within the students in our sample was associated with higher grade point average, right? And so even if we're just interested in things like their GPA, this is a way to achieve that goal. And why and how does that work? And it's mainly because we find, and Dr. Sean Ginnery talks about this a lot, the ways in which critical consciousness promotes resilience, right, in the face of these oppressive forces like racism. And the way it does that is that by having critical consciousness, you're less likely to engage in things like self-blame, right, for issues that are largely structural, right, and be able to be prepared to deal with racism and other forces of oppression when that happens, because you're prepared for it, because you're expecting it, and then ready to figure out how to make the next move, if that makes sense. And so we showed you that definition by Freire, which really had critical consciousness sort of split into two parts, this notion of recognition, this analysis piece, and then putting it into action, the social action piece, which we think makes sense. And we built on the research of Watts, Deamer, and Voigt, who actually conceptualized a third part to critical consciousness. And so in this, as we can see in the slide, in this framework, and we think this one makes even more sense for us, right, is that there's a social analysis piece, right? There's a piece called political agency, and then there's a piece called social action, and we'll talk about what each of those means right now, right? So social analysis, right, is the ability to name and analyze the social, political, and economic forces that contribute to inequity and inequality, right? And so we're going to talk about in a few minutes the ways in which some schools and some particular courses, for example, help students really build the skills to understand, name, analyze, figure out what is racism, how does it work, how is it impacting my life, like what are the different ways it can look. And so that's what we mean by social analysis. Political agency, which is one we haven't talked about much yet, is the belief that one has the capacity to affect social or political change. And so in this regard, we're talking about giving young folks the practice and a practice with the behaviors and disposition, so that when asked, or when asked either hypothetically or in reality, whether they think that they can do anything about any of the things that they feel like need changing, that they feel that they can do that. Right? And so that's what political agency means, giving them that feeling that they can do change. And then we have that third component, which is called social action, which is a wide range of activities through which individuals seek to resist and challenge oppressive forces. And what we're going to see is we'll give a few examples of the ways in which some schools, through curricular and other activities, made it an essential part of the learning process to then take that learning and move it out into action outside the walls of the school. And so and we'll see what a variety of ways that can look like moving forward. And so this is where I'm going to pass it off to Scott to tell us a little bit about our study and move into our first wave of research findings.
Great. Thanks so much, Daren. And it's a pleasure to be here today presenting to you all. And so Daren gave you a terrific overview of what critical consciousness is and why we thought it could be a useful framework for thinking about the role that schools and educators can play in supporting youth's ability to analyze, navigate, and challenge racial injustice. And so that was really the question with which we started our study. Okay, you said, okay, there's a growing body of, there's theoretical work by Paulo Freire that suggests that critical consciousness is a mechanism by which society can be transformed and injustice can be, challenged. And there's a growing body of psychological research that young people of color who are critically conscious are more resilient, have higher self-esteem, are more politically engaged, are more academically achieving. And so, well, what are the practices by which schools can support youth in becoming more critically conscious? And by no means do we think schools are the only places where young people are becoming critically conscious. Like, quite the contrary. Like, we recognize that parents are playing a substantial role, a leading role in their children's critical consciousness development, as are faith organizations, out of school programs, other mentors, and community members, and so on and so forth. But as school people, we're really interested in the role that schools could play in contributing to this work. And so what we did is we set up a study where we said, we're going to follow young people from their first day of high school to their last day of high school. And we chose the class of 2017, and we're going to measure how their critical consciousness changes over their 4 years of high school. And then we're also going to pay attention to the role that their schools and their educators are playing in contributing to their critical consciousness development. And so what we did as part of the study is we sought out 5 different schools, 5 different high schools that were all serving almost entirely Black and Latinx youth. They were all schools located in northeastern cities, in 4 different northeastern cities. They all made some reference to civic development in their mission statements. They all said, sort of fostering young people's ability to engage as citizens was a central piece of what they did, but they all took different approaches to the work, different pedagogical approaches. And our goal was to look for places where young people in a particular school were demonstrating outsized growth, like whether they were, to find, a group of students who were particularly strong or demonstrated particular growth in the ability to analyze social forces, or demonstrated particular growth or were particularly strong in their ability to engage in social action, and to really understand what role their school might be playing in that development. And so we surveyed students 5 times over the course of their high school experiences. We interviewed a subset of those students, 60 of those students, at the end of freshman year, at the end of sophomore year, at the end of junior year, at the end of senior year. And we and our research team spent over 300 days observing in those schools, sitting in on classes, sitting in on extracurricular activities, attending community meetings, so that we could see firsthand what types of practices these different schools were engaging in. And what we want to talk to you about today are 5 different tools that we saw across these schools for fostering young people's critical consciousness. These weren't the only tools that we saw, but these were some of the most prominent, and the ones we wanted to share with you today. And so I'm going to talk first about this idea of introducing a framework. So one of the schools in our study was a school that we call Make the Road Academy. And this was a school that had explicitly named itself after Paulo Freire, and it was actively trying to incorporate some of Paulo Freire's educational practices into their work with students. And you can see here this picture of Paulo Freire is actually a mural in the lobby of the school, which gives you some sense of the extent to which Freire represented a central dimension of the work the school was doing. And when we looked at our survey data, you remember that we'd surveyed students at the beginning of freshman year, the end of freshman year, the end of sophomore year, the end of junior year, the end of senior year. Something we noticed was that the young people at this school at Make the Road Academy, they finished high school with significantly higher awareness of systemic racism than their peers across the other schools we were studying. So there was something about this group of young people that led them to finish high school with a deeper understanding of the way in which racism can be systemic and institutional. And we were curious to look at our qualitative data to try to understand, well, what's this school doing that might be contributing to that? And what we found a number of things, but one of the most important was that in the 9th grade at Make the Road Academy, all of the students took a class called social engagement, alongside math and English and social studies and so on and so forth. And in this social engagement class, students were introduced to this framework that was called the 3 I's framework. And it was a framework for making sense of oppression. And in the framework, effectively laid out for students that oppression can be interpersonal in nature, it can be institutional in nature, or it can be internalized in nature, and this 3 I's framework gave students sort of a language and a way of thinking about how oppressive social forces like racism works. There's interpersonal racism, where one individual might discriminate against another individual. There's institutional racism, such as sort of the fact that Black and Latinx youth are disproportionately likely to be suspended or expelled in public schooling. There's internalized oppression, because of course, if you're living in a society where racism is pernicious and persistent, even members of a marginalized group can internalize some of those messages. And then the young people, not only learn this framework, but did activities to make use of this framework. So for instance, in one activity, the students had to draw a picture of a community in which these three I's of oppression were prevalent. And you can see a picture on the slide of a young person's drawing where there are sort of all sorts of forms of oppression happening. But then, sort of after drawing this picture, the young people studied the Black Panther Party's platform for self-defense, which offers, the Black Panther Party's perspective on how to combat those forms of oppression and what a community so emancipated from those forms of oppression would look like. And then the students were assigned to draw a second picture where those 10 points of the Black Panther Party's platform were implemented within a community, and served as sort of a buffer against those forms of oppression. And so that was sort of just one example of the ways in which the young people in the social engagement class were working to understand how oppression works. And what we found was that, as our quantitative data had suggested, that the young people at Make the Road Academy really did possess a deep understanding of how oppression works, in large part because of that social engagement class that served as a framework for their next couple of years of high school. And so one of the young people that we interviewed was this young man named Michael. And in his 12th grade interview, so several years after he had taken the social engagement class, we were asking Michael a little bit about how oppression and racism in particular works. And Michael explained, like in our city, there's a lot of chicken shacks everywhere. You can always find a chicken shack here. But if you go out to like the suburbs or something like that, you're not going to find one nowhere around. Like you might find a Whole Foods or like a farmer's market or something like that. The options of everything is just much different. And it just seems like certain things are put where they are put for a reason. And I think what you can hear in Michael's language is a really sophisticated understanding of how institutionalized forms of oppression work and systemic forms of oppression work. He's sort of talking about the idea of food deserts, and that different communities are sort of given access to different levels of nutrition. And so we followed up a few minutes later by asking Michael, how did you learn to make sense of the world like that? And he pointed to the freshman year social engagement class. He said, freshman year, when we was in the social engagement class, it made me think about stuff differently. And once I started thinking about it, you start putting the pieces together and you start noticing like nothing happens just because. Like it's all for some reason. Somebody's benefiting from everything. Somebody's not benefiting from everything. It's set up this way for a certain reason. And so that type of qualitative interview with Michael and many of his classmates were really useful to us in pushing us to recognize the role that the social engagement class was playing in these young people's ability to analyze an oppressive social force like racism. And I'll just sort of say quickly that one of the things that made the social engagement class so powerful was that because students took it in their 9th grade year of high school, at the start of high school, and then sort of took ownership over this framework for making sense of oppression, that meant that these young people's teachers in all their other classes and all their other grades all throughout high school could draw upon that same framework to analyze everything from literary text to historical events to statistics in the newspaper. And so you can see here a picture of from a 10th grade English class. So a year later, a 10th grade English teacher was having students read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And one of the key themes in The Bluest Eye is about the ways in which racism leads to internalized oppression, in many cases for people of color. And you can see the students, one of the students here who's done some artwork, sort of thinking about the role that racism in our society can have in terms of the way in which it can contribute to internalized forms of oppression. And so we saw that sort of over and over in classes across the Make the Road Academy curriculum, where teachers were making use of the fact that they knew students had this framework for understanding of oppression, and they could use that framework to help students go even deeper into the material in their respective classes. And so let me, and maybe I'll just say that in this moment that we find ourselves in now, I think that a framework like the 3 I's framework is really important for understanding something like the fact that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting, men and women of color. And I think that that's a form, being able to dig into that issue and understand that issue requires an understanding of the institutionalized form of oppression and thinking about the ways in which systems and institutions in our country aren't serving well people of color in comparison to white people. And I think that COVID-19 brings that out, but you need a framework like the 3 I's of oppression to help young people sort of sort through that. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to let Daren take over and talk a little bit about another lever, students teaching students.
Thanks, Scott. So as Scott said, we have another tool here that we saw happening in our schools called Students Teaching Students, and we'll explain a little bit about this looks like in terms of the development of critical consciousness. So we'll use Leadership High as our vignette, and I think we said this before, but all these schools that we're talking about, these are our pseudonyms. And Leadership High was a school that took what we would call like an action civics approach. The mission of the school was to educate socially responsible students for a life of active and engaged citizenship. And we see here is just in the picture is just something you'd see on the walls of the school, just outlining different ways that students could or should be actively engaged both inside and outside the walls of their school. And so when it came to our data analysis of our quantitative data, this was a school for whom students showed that, they showed basically growth over the 4 time periods in terms of commitment to five time periods in terms of commitment to activism, and that this school compared to our other schools in the project, that their students on average had the highest levels of commitment to activism. And so we were really interested in thinking about how that came to be. So at Leadership Academy, what we saw was that much like, but in a different time in their school lives, as we saw in Make the Road Academy, students at Leadership Academy all took in their 12th grade, this is at the end of their high school, this Sociology of Change class, where they were educated around issues of organizing, how to affect change, how to be actively engaged. They got exposed to Marshall Ganz's theories around organizing, got to see some ways that organizing is happening in like online spaces such as Twitter these days. So they got a real education in the content and dispositions and behaviors one would need to engage in change. And then what they did with that is after all these 12th graders took this course, it culminated in a sort of in a 12th grade capstone graduation experience called Change the World projects, where each 12th grader would be engaged in a project that they would have to organize around a specific issue of concern to the school, to their community, to themselves, right? And that this project would be both about educating themselves about these issues, but more importantly, educating others and taking action around those issues, hopefully outside the walls of the school. And then they would then come back after that project was over to then present the findings of their work or the fruits of their labor to a panel of faculty members as part of the way that they end up completing their graduation capstone requirement. And so what we see here is just 2 different examples. On the left here, we see a student who organized a protest in front of a local police precinct because of the police brutality issues that were happening in their community. On the right, we see a student who organized, so their community is going through a lot of gentrification, and this is a big issue in their community. It's a lot of change. People in the community and in the school, are worried about how this is playing out for the folks who are currently living in that neighborhood. And so this student who's sitting at the end of the table in this picture with 3 elders organized a community panel around gentrification that the community was invited to. That she invited community elders and other stakeholders from the community to come and engage in a meaningful conversation about how to move ahead as a community around these issues of gentrification. So very powerful projects. And what we're going to hear now is some of the students at the school talking about the Change the World projects. Here we have Angela, who's an 11th grader, saying, some of the seniors had to make a Change the World project in order to graduate. And their project was like, make some kind of change with like police violence. So like we basically went on a march, I guess. We went to a precinct and then we just stood there with posters. Some of us laid on the ground, and we stayed there for a while. Okay. So here we hear Angela, who's, by the way, an 11th grader, hasn't even done this, organized one herself, who's talking about the ways in which, this project did indeed take them out of the school into the world to be engaged. And also you can see that the ways in which, as you hear in Angela's answers, the ways in which students who are not even yet to 12th grade start to become involved, right, in the projects. And yes, and so, and have that, and then we hear Angela saying, it made me feel like maybe what I'm doing might change something. Maybe people are going to start seeing what we did as something important. And my guess is that this is exactly the kind of ways that the Leadership Academy want their students to feel as they're moving into 12th grade, right? So I think Angela here sounds like she's in a perfect place, right, to engage in these Change the World project, because it sounds like she's probably been through a few of these, herself, right? And then it's starting to feel like these projects actually are worth something or can make some changes, right? And then we have a ninth grader, right? A ninth grader, Sokoto, saying, I feel like the 12th graders are teaching us their way so that we're able to get to the 12th grade and have Change the World project that actually means something. So imagine someone like Sokoto, who's a ninth grader, who's going to get literally 3 years of multiple 12th graders students, right? Change the World projects that she's going to experience either personally or vicariously before she even has to do her own with other peers who are also 12th graders in her 12th grade cohort. So it was both a powerful project and process in the terms of getting the students out into the world and doing that social action piece. And there was a way in which that became a culture of the school, in which students, no matter where they were in their tenure at the school, were going to feel that this was a part of being a student at that school, this being engaging in that social action, right? And what that means for our current situation is that we're going to have to think. I mean, yes, we talked about before. There's going to be lots of wonderful things that we can analyze. Sadly, when we're talking about racial inequality, given our current condition. And we're also in conditions where, we might be, or very likely be, geographically restricted by things like quarantines or otherwise. And so what we have to start thinking about is what can civic engagement look like, even if it means that we can't go directly to the place. If we can't have some gathering, or we can't go to some community partner, right, and bring a whole bunch of folks there. Thinking about thinking at the intersection of the technological possibilities, right, which have lots of possibilities, especially around, information dissemination and otherwise, right? And thinking about, learning at the intersection of technological possibilities and social action, thinking about what that looks like when we're in a virtual space, and we have lots of great models for us these days. And so now I'm going to pass it back to Scott to talk about another common tool that we saw in our research.
Great, thanks so much, Daren. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about schools in our study that were able to give students opportunity to affect change within their school community. And so a third school in our study was a high school that we call a Spiritu High School. Spiritu is a member of the Coalition of Essential Schools, which takes a really inquiry-based approach to teaching and learning, with a real focus on what are the habits of mind that we're sort of working to foster in students, and sort of using curriculum and programming and practices to try to foster very specific habits of mind. And you can see in this picture, there's a poster that we took a picture of from one of the history classes at the school. What is my voice and how can I use it? And I think this is a very apt picture for a Spiritu High School, because what we found was that the young people at a Spiritu High School demonstrated both the steepest growth over 4 years of high school and finished high school at the highest levels of political agency. In other words, the young people at a Spiritu High School express more, as they were graduating from high school in 2017, express more confidence about their ability to affect political change than their peers across the other schools in our study. And you can see they also actually demonstrated the steepest growth in that quality. And so we were really interested to look at our qualitative data and try to understand what was happening. And what we found were a number of different practices that a Spiritu High School utilized to foster students' feelings of political agency. But let me tell you about one of them. So in the 11th grade, all of the students at a Spiritu High School took a civics class. And the first unit in the civics class was for students to go, as a class, to go through the school handbook and identify a policy that they believed was unfair or unjust. And the young people in the class of 2017, when it was their turn to take the civics class, which were the students we were studying, they chose the school's electronic device policy. And you can see from this picture that basically, as of 2016, a Spiritu High School had a pretty draconian technology policy, where basically the rule was like, when we're in class, we put technology away. And the students had some questions about that. Like, they felt like there were ways in which technology could actually be used to facilitate learning, and that the school wasn't, adequately taking advantage of it. And so as part of this unit, the students identified this policy they wanted to change. They spent several weeks doing research on the role that electronic devices can play in fostering learning, whether that's a tablet or a laptop or a phone or headphones, music. They looked at what the research had to say, and then they took that research and formulated a new policy proposal. And what the students came up with was this idea that rather than having this sort of blanket ban on technology, that all of the students in the school should be issued a technology pass that they would sort of wear around their neck, like on a lanyard, and that technology pass, or the media pass is what they called it, the media pass would give the students the right to use their technology, whether it's phones or tablets or smartwatches or computers, at particular points in the school day. And they also articulated in the proposal that there were actions a student could take to lose their technology pass or their media pass, and they sort of outlined how that would work. And the students really spent, again, several weeks kind of going back and forth about what the proposal was and the language of the proposal, and discussing and debating everything, from really big questions about, at what points in the day should there be sort of, student autonomy to use technology, and what point shouldn't there be, to really small questions like, if students are going to wear their media pass on their necks around, on a lanyard around their necks, like, should the school be paying for the lanyards, or should the students have to, purchase their own lanyards? They really literally talked through, all sorts of issues, big and small, related to the proposal, and then ultimately took the proposal and the research they did, put it into a presentation, practiced the presentation, and ultimately delivered the presentation to the school's faculty at a faculty meeting. And just to give you just a little flavor of that, like at the very end of this about 20-minute presentation, the young man who was sort of finishing off the presentation, students took turns, said, in summary, the technology policy is outdated and incorrect, particularly in regard to tablets. So the media pass allows the use of phones and headphones at certain times. There's no media pass at lunch, because this is when we need to be more social and put away electronics. And it helps us prepare for college, because in college you have more freedom to decide what you want to do. And the students finished the presentation, the faculty applauded, and promised the students to give serious consideration to the policy. And then what the faculty did about a day or two later was they wrote a letter to their students, and they wrote, "Dear civics class, congratulations on a very well done presentation." And then they said, "We find ourselves with a couple questions we're hoping you could respond to." And they asked a number, and these are just a few of the questions they asked, but they were robust and rigorous questions. One of them was, you presented an article about the benefits of headphones, but there's many other studies that indicate students achieve lower test scores with music. Did you do selective research? And there were a number of questions like that forced the students to go back into the research and craft responses to the questions from the faculty. But I think this was a way in which the faculty really demonstrated that they were taking the students very seriously, and the students crafted responses to those answers, sent them back to the faculty considered, and by a vote, and this is, I think, a really brilliant move on the part of the faculty voted to approve changing to this new technology policy sort of offered by the civics class on a trial basis for the rest of the school year. And so they were going to try out this media pass policy, technology policy for the rest of the school year. And if it worked well, the school would adopt this as a permanent new policy and sort of replace the old policy in the handbook. And if it didn't work well, then the technology policy would revert back to the language in the handbook until another group or another civics class, was able to come up with something different. And what we found in our interviews with the young people in the class of 2017 is that they experienced this opportunity to affect change within their school community as enormously gratifying and as a big win. And so just as one example, a young lady, Janelle, that we interviewed, explained to us that, "I never really thought that schools listen to students, but a spiritual really listens to its students. And being able to make change here, it does impact my future, because I believe if I can make change within a small group, I can make change over a big group throughout a long period of time." And when we started this project together, I think Daren and I felt genuinely unsure about whether opportunities to make change in the school setting would have sort of effects on students' feelings of political agency for other communities that they're a part of. And what we found, through our interviews with students like Janelle and through our survey data and so on, and our observations, was that for young people, your school community is as real a community as any other community that you're a part of. And so opportunities to make change within your school community unequivocally strengthen your sense of political agency, because you are making real change in a community that is meaningful to you. And so this is another example of a practice we found that that had some real effects on a key dimension of critical consciousness. And when we think about the current moment that we find ourselves in, I think that one of the things that's been really challenging for schools and educators around COVID-19 is that almost none of us are experts on emergency remote learning. I dare say, like, none of us are experts in having to switch to a remote learning, approach to schooling, at the drop of a hat. And of course, that's overall like a really, really challenging thing for educators and schools to contend with. But if there is a silver lining in that, I think it represents an opportunity for us to privilege and draw upon the expertise of students and families. And so if we're in a situation where almost none of us have expertise, then this does represent an important opportunity to say to students, like, you help us figure out what's working in your learning process and help us sort of come up with the policies and the platforms and the procedures and the practices. And so I do think there are lots of moments within this challenging period we find ourselves in to foster a sense of political agency in the young people with whom we're working, and give them the sense that I have the ability to affect change within this school community that I'm part of and that's meaningful to me. And so I'm going to turn back to Daren to talk a little bit about another tool, real world assignments.
Thanks, Scott. And so, yes, let's talk about real world assignments as another tool for helping students develop critical consciousness. We'll look at it through the example of a school called, I believe we're going to go to the next slide. It's got Community Academy, which is an expeditionary learning school. Its mission is to develop in students the knowledge, skills, and commitment to envision a better world and work to achieve it. And so you can see in the mission that much like the school I talked about before, Leadership Academy, there was very much a goal for learning to culminate in action for sure, and some form of civic engagement in or outside of the school. And we saw, much like in Community Academy, that the statistics showed that there was, in terms of students' commitment to activism, that over those 5 time periods, we saw growth over those 5 time periods. And then we also saw that this school ended up in a good place relative to the other schools in terms of the commitment to activism as well. We wanted, much like we did before, we wanted to figure out how or why that was happening. And so at Community Academy, this took the form of real world assignments. And so we'll just talk about 2 real quickly right here. On the left, we have a picture, which was the culmination of a wonderful assignment. So on the left, the folks at Community Academy had found out that a consulate of a foreign country had deemed the community that Community Academy was located in as basically a no-go zone, as a place that was dangerous, that folks who were visiting the United States should not visit if they were concerned about their safety. Folks at Community Academy had found out about this, were obviously very upset about this. And so the teachers helped them embark upon this academic and civic engagement activity where they both did the research about these issues, how this happens, who makes these decisions, why, et cetera, gather some information to help counter the misconceptions that these folks had about their community. And then, as we see in this picture here, culminated in the students showing up and talking to the consul general of that country to let them know that they didn't like this policy and that they suggest changing it. And I believe ultimately that's what ended up happening in that regard. So it's an exciting opportunity for these students to speak truth to power, like literally, right? As they're speaking to them right there, we can see. Another example of a project like this was a unit that was looking at thinking about the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, what kind of political relationship it does have, should Puerto Rico be a state? Should it be a commonwealth? Should it be its own independent nation? Did a lot of research about the different stances in that regard, and then ultimately ended up sending letters to their Congress people about what they each thought should the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico should be. So we can see the culmination in the action piece there. And then in terms of what that sounded like, here we have 9th grader named Dana saying, I feel like it gives us a voice because we're writing letters to the senators and representatives. And I feel like we send out those letters that if that it would make some type of improvement to what's happening. And so that's, so that's just powerful, right? We hear both the action piece and that efficacy piece going on in there. This is a 9th grader. This is a student who's just starting at community academy and has come to this conclusion that like they can, be talking to their elected officials to make change. So that's just a really powerful way in which we heard that coming from the voices of the students. In terms of this current moment, we have lots of potential, again, this is sort of a good thing if you're like, love, critical consciousness work. It's a bad thing because there's so many, issues of social importance that are going on in the world, but there's so much rich material, right, to have students be thinking about what they think should be going on, what they should be doing about it, and then doing something about it, right? And we can see that doing something about it could be like literally showing up at, the doorstep of power, or it could be, sending letters or other things like that. And so there's a ton, always is, but especially these days, very topical issues for folks to be building real world assignments around. So I'm going to pass it back to Scott to talk about one more tool that we saw in our research.
Great, thanks so much, Daren. The final tool we want to talk about is this idea of teachers getting personal, and I think we'll each sort of share a little bit about this particular piece that we saw sort of manifesting itself in different ways across the different schools. And so one thing I'd say that we observed was that the teachers of color in the various schools often would share something from their own experiences that related to their experiences contending with systems of oppression like racism. And so one example is this teacher, Ms. Lila Dennett, who was an African-American English teacher at Make the Road Academy, and she had assigned her students to do narrative writing and to write a narrative essay about an important moment in their lives. And as sort of a way of modeling the assignment, Ms. Dennett had actually written her own narrative. And she wrote about this moment when she was in grad school. And she says, "I chose to write about the white classmate who told me I'd never graduate. What happened was I went up to a student and asked if I could be part of her study group. And she said no, because no one thought I'd graduate. Imagine someone telling you that on the second day of graduate school that you're going to fail. And there will be people who say that to you." And, and this is just a little excerpt from both Ms. Dennett's narrative, but also sort of a little bit of her conversation with the class. But her students, who themselves were almost entirely African-American, had lots of questions for her about this experience and how she had dealt with it. And she was really honest about that she went home and cried. She sort of described herself as going home and crying, and then her mother sort of pushing her to show back up again the next day and keep on moving. And I think that this, and we saw examples like this across the board in the schools that we're studying. And I think they really point to the way in which educators of color have an opportunity to play a particularly powerful role in the critical conscience development of the young people they serve, because they're able to sort of share personal narratives that connect to the experiences of many of the young people of color with whom they're working. And so that was sort of one piece of this teachers getting personal tool that we found, but that's not to say that white teachers don't have a role to play as well when it comes to getting personal. I'll ask Daren just to say a word or two about that.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. In another school that we looked at, which had more of actually a no excuses kind of a model, we saw an example of a white teacher who I think represented a model for what for possibilities for white teachers engaging in this work. And I think what we're about to describe in terms of getting personal, I think is this white teacher modeling for other teachers, white teachers in particular, vulnerability and reflexivity in terms of thinking about one's own positionality as a white person teaching students of color in particular. So here we have the example of Mr. Kamen, who was at Tubman High. He was a white teacher of an African-American literature course, right? So here's a white teacher teaching, in this case, a lot of like James Baldwin, for example, right? Two predominantly Black students. And so what happened is there was a subset of those students who were actually in another class, another extracurricular class around debate and thinking about a lot of critical issues that surfaced for them this question about what does it mean for Mr. Kamen, white teacher, to be teaching Baldwin to us in ways that they thought were kind of decontextualizing each other's positionality, right, in that conversation. And so these students raised that issue with Mr. Kamen. And what we liked about Mr. Kamen is the way in which, and he was a more veteran teacher, so some of it was like he was positioned to take this advice really well, but we could see a lot of teachers, regardless of race, having students come to them and saying, we have suggestions for how this could be taught better or more authentically, and we could imagine many teachers pushing back against that. We could imagine many white teachers being told by Black students that we're somewhat uncomfortable with the way this is going down, for that person to get very defensive, if not try and shut the conversation down, unlike Mr. Kamen, who I think, again, was a teacher who was reflective in this regard, right? Open to hearing this feedback from the students, and subsequently made changes. And we saw, and the cool thing is we got to see it, right? We got to observe it, see changes in the ways in which he taught this course. And the way that played out in a lot of ways was actually giving rather than telling the Black students about themselves and how this is manifesting in their lives and so on and so forth, it was to give the students a little bit more ownership over the content, and help Mr. Kamen figure out ways that he can make connections to what he wanted to connect it to, given to the ways that the students were authentically connecting to the work themselves as Black and Latinx students. I hope that makes sense. And we can hear a quote from Melissa, one of the students in the class. He was really receptive to their ideas being the students who decided to push back, right? And I think he's going to work on changing it, because this is like the first year that the class is made. I think the feedback was really helpful. And we can confirm that Mr. Kamen did indeed make those changes in how he taught. So it's just a wonderful example of ways, excuse me, in which white teachers can position themselves from an authority perspective, but also just from a personal perspective, right? In terms of engaging in this work, and particularly around being reflective about one's identity in regard to this work around race and racism, especially when we're potentially a white teacher teaching students of color. In terms of this current moment, right, man, the vulnerability piece, right, it's gonna, again, like there's gonna be ways in which we have this, if we're doing this remote learning thing, that by itself, the notion of being the teacher in a remote place, trying to, herd the learning of some other amount of students who are not in the same room as you, already requires, right, some measure of thinking about how you're going to rethink your type of authority with your students. And in this moment with COVID and other things that are going on, even more so, it's gonna really make us reposition the type of authority that we're establishing with our students. And I think what I would suggest is that teachers are establishing what we saw in these last few examples, were teachers establishing what I would call a sense of personal authority. Do what I say because I care about you. I'm invested in your well-being, as opposed to positional authority, which is do what I say because I'm the teacher or I'm the adult. So this was a quick run through of a lot of things that came through in our research. There was so many, it feels awkward sometimes when Scott and I do these presentations, because it's like two of us presenting, when there was really a massive team of folks who helped us make this possible. I mean, first and foremost, just the students and the teachers and the schools who just allowed us to come into their space. We spent many, many days and hours in people's classrooms, watching them teach, watching them learn, talking to them, asking them personal questions. And so we very much thank our participants. We had I can't name them all, we had a massive team of fellow doctors, grad students, undergrads, right, who helped us along the way, who came with their own sets of expertise around methodology, around content. We want to thank here our research team. And of course, this was not possible without our funding support from the National Academy of Education, the Spencer Foundation, the Templeton Foundation, and the BU Undergrad Research Opportunity Program. So we thank them very much for this opportunity. And thank you all. We want to thank y'all very much. If you are interested if you're interested in learning more about this work and getting more details about how this could be working in your particular context, we urge you to buy the book Schooling for Critical Consciousness, right? Which is published by Harvard Ed Press. We have the information right here. I think you still might be able to get, despite what the date says on the slide, a discount if you use the code. So we encourage you to do that. And we thank you very much for this opportunity.